The past, wrote novelist L.P. Hartley, is a foreign country. They do things differently there. The Boyd County Courthouse, a landmark for many years to the people of Catlettsburg and Boyd County. But you know, nearly 2 centuries ago, things in Boyd County were a lot different than the way they are today. How different it seems to us now with our 20th century perspective to flash back almost 2 centuries ago and imagine a time before there was a Boyd County, a Catlettsburg, or an Ashland. How different it seems to imagine a time before telephones, before electricity, before steamboats, automobiles, or railroads. How different it seems to imagine a time when men and women of indomitable spirit and genuine courage sailed down the Ohio River in flatboats or traveled overland in ox-drawn wagons to come to eastern Kentucky and forge a home out of the wilderness. It's easy to see what attracted the early settlers to the hills of eastern Kentucky. In the late 18th century, there was an untouched beauty to the land. There were rugged mountain ranges, dense forests, fertile farmlands, abundant natural resources, and the powerful Ohio River. The river brought pioneers by the boatload to this area, as well as trappers and traders who dealt in luxuries like sugar, salt, coffee, and tea. Circuit riders brought the gospel. Horseback riders brought the mail. And the first families of the area, the Catletts and the Pogues, brought the dream. They blazed a path that others would follow of finding a new frontier home on the banks of the Ohio.
Alexander Catlett was a wealthy Virginian. In 1849, Horatio Catlett laid out the city of Catlettsburg and was named for him. It is the county seat of Boyd County. Horatio Catlett's family came to the mouth of the Big Sandy in 1898. His father, Alexander, brought his slaves and his family and settled at the mouth of the Big Sandy to trade and start a new existence. Horatio Catlett became very wealthy. He was a merchant, a farmer, a postmaster, and he had the Catlett Tavern, the first tavern in Catlettsburg, and such notables as Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson and Mr. Grundy visited him. That was a stagecoach line between Lexington and Charlottesville, Virginia, so this must have been a convenient stopping place for them.
In 1799, Colonel John Pogue and his brother, Robert Pogue, came here and settled on, or built a house on, brick house on 28th and the riverfront. They had their slaves with them, and they hauled the bricks from Vanceburg. In fact, they brought them up the river. And after the house was built, their families came here from North Carolina, and different families built homes on the farmland, which they owned all. It was given to the Pogue family as a gift of their service during the Revolutionary War. And the community sprang up, and it became a pretty good size place, or community, or place, and it was called Pogue Settlement. They owned a couple of charcoal iron foundries, which they had established in Boyd County. And that's the way it really started.
Now, the first settler in Catlettsburg was not the Catletts. It was the Charles Smith, who fought in the French and Indian War, was granted 400 acres of land And though that land was part of the Savage Grant, is located where Catlettsburg is built. So the Catlett, and he came here in '74 and died in '76, and Alexander Catlett, he was nicknamed Sawney, bought up some of the land. But
land was cleared, homes were built, crops were planted, trails were opened, mills, businesses, churches, and schools were started. The new river communities began to take shape. After the Indian threat subsided, more pioneers traveled to places that now were called Catlettsburg and Pogue Settlement to stake their claim on a new life in a new land. The work was hard, but the first settlers soon realized that this area's potential was unlimited. Catlettsburg's strategic location at the juncture of the Ohio and Big Sandy rivers made this Gate City port a thriving trading and manufacturing city long before Ashland was on the map. The beautiful oak, pine, poplar, cherry, and walnut forests of the Big Sandy Valley proved to be Catlettsburg's greatest economic assets. At one time, the Gate City was reputed to be one of the largest round timber markets in the world. Massive rafts of logs picked up from ports up and down the Big Sandy would stretch almost all the way across the width of the Ohio. Regularly, they would set sail, floating idly down the river to eager buyers in Louisville or Cincinnati.
It was a large logging industry up there at Catlettsburg. The logs floated down the Big Sandy River and to the Ohio, and that's where they separated and went on to maybe Cincinnati, or they had a largest hardwood lumber company in the world in Arden.
Up on 1850, most of the trade on the river was the timber trade and other related river products. And by 18, well, they had a population of 1,100 in this little town by 1850. And as the timber trade began to grow and expand in leaps and bounds, by 1860 there was about 1,300 people in the area. And in 1866, and the timber trade was growing in leaps and bounds, attracting more and more settlers. At first, the timber was brought down from the mountains in Big Sandy in rafts, and sometimes they would tie as many as 20 together, and they were guided by men. So it became an important trade center in the valley. The value of timber sold in Catlettsburg in 1860 was $1,500,000. Sounds like a growing business. By 1886, Catlettsburg had grown tremendously and was considered one of the important commercial centers in the state, and it was a leading city in the Big Sandy Valley.
Hundreds of people flocked to Catlettsburg to cash in on the timber boom. New businesses like tanneries, wagon makers, and sawmills sprang up. All of them were clearly dependent on the rise or fall of the timber trade.
I spent a lot of long hours in this gymnasium practicing. But the hard work paid off. We won a state high school championship in 1961, and a few years later a team called Rupp's Runts missed winning the NCAA championship by only one game. Hi, I'm Larry Conley, and this spirit of hard work and dedication is still alive today at Third National Bank. I haven't lost my touch, and neither has Third National. I'm Larry Conley. I've always been associated with winning teams. From the state champion Ashland Tomcats in 1961 to captain of Rupp's Runts, the NCAA runner-up in 1966. Now I'm working for another winning team, Third National Bank. Third National has a dedicated staff of banking professionals working hard for your financial needs. There's another thing I like about working for Third National Bank. They're a Kentucky bank.
Down the road a ways in Pogue Settlement, a Greenup County farmer named Richard Deering made a discovery that would help to realize that area's business and industrial potential. That discovery was iron ore. In the early 1800s, Deering constructed a small, crude furnace on his farm, and he smelted the first iron in the region. This iron filled molds for hammers, skillets, pots, and other necessary homestead items. Thanks to Deering's ingenuity, his neighbors would no longer have to wait on expensive shipments from Virginia and Maryland furnaces to arrive. They could purchase the iron utensils they needed locally. Eventually, though, demand exceeded supply. So Deering struck a partnership with other local business people to create the Argolite furnace, the first charcoal iron furnace in the area. These huge old stones, they're all that remain, really, of the old Bellefonte furnace. And once the air in eastern Kentucky was thick with the charcoal smoke from the Bellefonte, the Amanda, the Buena Vista, the Clinton, and the Princess furnaces.
They were close to the iron ore and rocks, and clay. One of the early ones was the Clinton furnace, which is out, it was crossed up in the holler from where the Rose Hill Baptist Church is. And then they owned Amanda furnace, which was between here and Russell. And they helped build the Bellefonte furnace, which is part of it still standing out in Bellefonte. First big business that came into Ashland was the Ashland Coal and Iron Manufacturing Company, AC&I, we knew it. They built a railroad between Ashland and Rush, and to haul coal back in here to Ashland for the boats and also the furnaces. In 1867, they built the Ashland furnace, which was down on 6th in the riverfront. It was considered the largest furnace in the world in the day it was built. And that one was in one end of town. And in 1872, they built the Norton Iron Works. It had a very large furnace too, and it was on 22nd in the riverfront. Them was the three largest industries. It was in the early days of Ashland.
When the local supply of iron ore and timber began to diminish, the old furnaces made way for those that used coke and coal for fuel. And because of them, Ashland in subsequent decades would come to be known as the city where coal meets iron. But at that time, northeastern Kentucky and southern Ohio gained notoriety as the nation's leading iron producers west of the Alleghenies. Pig iron proved to be big business indeed in Pogue Settlement, which was still a part of Greenup County. As the furnaces multiplied, river traffic increased, moving eastern Kentucky iron down the Ohio to other lucrative markets. More and more settlers came to the furnace communities in search of work. More homes were built to house the workers and their families. More retail businesses opened to supply their material needs. Amid such prosperity, both Catlettsburg and Pogue Settlement had shrewd leaders who were planning for the future in many ways. In both communities, local citizens saw education as another means of providing a more promising tomorrow for their children and for the area. Some of the wealthier frontier families had solved the education problem by sending their children to private schools back east. Some hired private tutors. Some did nothing. Because for many local residents, education was a luxury, a low priority when compared with simple survival. But other citizens had an educational vision that, well, it matched the area's industrial ambitions. They knew that education was essential if the communities were to grow and prosper. So in each town, they worked together to expand educational opportunities.
Well, the first public school was on the corner of 13th and Winchester, where Gibson's Brothers is today. It's a one-room schoolhouse frame, and in 1876, they built a very large two-story brick school on 14th and Carter. And it was known as Central High School. And then in 1897, they built the monstrosity, which we all called it, of Crab School. It had a large tower on it and a lot of gingerbread work. It was a beautiful school. I went there, and it lasted. It was Ashland High School for years, and until they built the high school up on Lexington Avenue in 1916. Some of the early people came in here and started the Beech Grove Academy. It was a pay school. It wasn't owned by the city. It was more like a pay college. It was operated for several years. Part of them buildings are still standing. The next modern school was Means in 1905, then Wowie and Bayless was in 1910. So that was the starting of our school system.
The school system here, starting back in the late teens and early 20s, we had, our population was about between 14,000 and 15,000. And then when Armco came in here, that thing started growing. Well, that meant more children. We built up then until up in the 50s, I guess about the 50s into the 60s, it looked like we just keep growing, and our children's enrollment in Ashland was over 6,000. At that time, something happened in Ashland. They ran out of space, really, to build new homes, and things got so old they started tearing them down. The automobile had a lot to do with it because they needed filling stations on the corners, and they started tearing things down. As the houses got old, they kept tearing them down, so our enrollment now, here in the 80s, is about 2/3 of that, or over 4,000, whereas we had over 6,000 one time.
Ashland Community College is a vital part of the University of Kentucky's community college system. At ACC, local students can get quality education. ACC has programs for students just out of high school to Donovan Scholars, 65 years old and older. The people of the Ashland area should be proud of their community college. ACC, just another reason I'm proud to say Ashland is my hometown. I'm Larry Conley for Third National Bank.
Downtown Catlettsburg, Kentucky. You know, back in the mid-1800s, Catlettsburg was the center of constant activity. Rafters and the wealthy timber barons were literally flooding into town, and Catlettsburg's newly constructed hotels, restaurants, and saloons, well, they could barely accommodate all the people. Steamers and ferries dotted the riverbanks. Showboats like the Cotton Blossom and the Water Queen would dock on the river. Their loud calliope music could be heard all over town.
It was very wild along Front Street. It was this one saloon right after another on Old Front Street.
In 1921, when Catlettsburg was growing, there was, I think, 21 saloons located on Front Street. And the Literary Digest said that it was the worst street in the United States. Those saloons were located on Front Street, which overlooked the Ohio River. Yeah.
The showboats landed there, right, the landing was there at Old Front Street in Division, where Division is. That's where the boat landing was, and the ferry boat crossed the river too also, and they had a wharf boat there, same place. These showboats also played Ashland. Some of the largest showboats on the rivers played both places, like the Goldenrod. And
There was really a festive atmosphere in Catlettsburg, as if that timber boom would never end. Pogue Settlement in the mid-1800s had reached a crossroads. Thanks to its overabundance of natural resources, the simple homespun farming community was on the brink of turning into a thriving industrial city itself. The one event that helped to rewrite the economic history of the town was the coming of the railroad. Local iron producers understood the railroad's potential to boost the economy of their small settlement. They knew that if the railroad could transport the mineral resources from surrounding Greenup and Carter counties through Pogue settlement, well, it would become the region's commercial center and industrial base. But there was a slight hitch. The Lexington and Big Sandy Railroad intended to bypass Pogue settlement on the route that was to be built from Lexington to Catlettsburg. They considered going through Pogue settlement the long way around. Well, the iron producers felt otherwise, so they organized a community meeting to discuss an alternative strategy to attract the railroad's attention, to get it to change its mind. Out of this meeting came the formation of the Kentucky Iron, Coal, and Manufacturing Company, a development company whose plan of action was to take options on land, create a city out of a tiny settlement, then provide the railroad with a right-of-way through instead of around the town. No longer simple farmers, when it came to business anyway, the iron producers had turned into wheeler dealers. The railroad found their offer, plus their $200,000 purchase of railroad stock, so doggone persuasive, well, it couldn't refuse. Many Catlettsburg residents, on the other hand, objected when the city fathers granted the railroad the right-of-way. One story has it that rather than incur the wrath of irate Gate Cityans in the daytime, rail crews would lay the track by moonlight. Meanwhile, in Pogue settlement, with the railroad finally coming, plans for the creation of the city were set in motion. Hilton Avenue in Ashland. It's named for M.T. Hilton, an engineer who was commissioned to map out the town that was to be named Ashland after Henry Clay's plantation home.
They hired Mr. Hilton. He was from Connecticut, and they hired him to lay these streets out, and that's why we have the big wide streets. He has visions of a big city being here someday, and that's why they laid it out the way it was.
When Hilton looked over the newly created Ashland, he saw acre after acre of farmland, a few businesses on Front Avenue, and some scattered home sites along the river. With incredible foresight, from this he envisioned a city of the future with spacious building lots, streets 100 feet wide, and a beautiful 40-acre park. Hilton was an ardent supporter of the new locality, as a letter he wrote to his sister in Maine would demonstrate. Quote, "The project is creating much excitement in other parts as well as here," he said. "All look upon it as a fine opening for businessmen, and being, as you are aware, a businessman, am thinking seriously of incorporating myself with the town, transporting my matrimonial wealth to it, and selling myself once more as a stage citizen, and perhaps at some future time my name may be enrolled among those who are acknowledged as city fathers." That's what Hilton wrote to his sister. In planning the town, there was a concerted effort to make room for expanding industries of every kind. Many businesses were already flourishing in the mid-1800s.
With my busy schedule, I don't always have time to take my checkbook along with me. With Third National Bank's Visa Checking, you don't need your checkbook. With Visa Checking, there's no check cashing hassle. Your purchase is automatically deducted from your Third National Bank checking account. Visa Checking from Third National Bank is everywhere you want to be, and Visa Checking is one more reason why Third National Bank should be your bank. One of the most famous authors in the world lived and wrote here in Greenup County at W Hollow, Jesse Stewart, who wrote such works as Man with a Bull-Tongue Plow and Taps for Private Tussey, called Kentucky the land he loved. If these United States can be called a body, Kentucky can be called its heart, Jesse wrote. I'm proud of Kentucky's heritage, and like Jesse Stewart, proud to call this area my home. I'm Larry Conley for Third National Bank.
In the summer of 1854, weekly newspapers in Catlettsburg, Ironton, Greenup, and Grayson carried announcements about Ashland's public land auction. Well, auction day took on all the excitement of a carnival, with people coming from all over the area by horseback, by boat, wagon, and by foot, just to watch as town lots were sold. To expedite matters, the auctioneer conducted business from the back of a flatbed wagon as he was transported from one lot to another.
Of course, the downtown lots sold for more than ones on the outskirts a little ways from downtown. The first lot was sold was the first lot below the Price Building on Greenup Avenue. That was the first one that was sold.
The Ironton Journal would report on the event a month later. Ashland, our juvenile neighbor up the river, said the newspaper, is going ahead swimmingly. About 300 lots have already been sold at an average of nearly $300 each. And the town site is already being largely dotted over with foundations for buildings. It will be recalled, the article continued somewhat sarcastically, that the conveyances of the lots contain Ironton liquor restrictions, ensuring at once a sober, industrious, and thrifty population, and the town has to back it. Immense resources of iron and stone coal, and there is nothing to prevent its permanent rapid growth until it becomes one of the largest towns in Kentucky. Only see to it that the resources in iron and coal are put to use. Well, the Journal needn't have worried. Ashland's business leaders were planning to do just that. Once the lots were sold, Ashland went on a real building spree. A bank, a post office, a brick plant, several new businesses, and even a hotel were quickly built. You know, I used to do this as a kid. I wondered if I could still do it. Just barely. Right over here is the site where the old Aldine Hotel once stood. It was an elegant 4-story structure. And you know, you could get a whole night's lodging for all of 15 cents. The Aldine soon became the social center of town, and it gained fame throughout the state for its fine hospitality.
It was built in 1854 on 15th and Front. It had 4 floors, 75 rooms and 1 bath. And it was a meeting place of Ashland. It was really where everybody gathered on Sunday in the gay 90s, promenaded up and down Front Street before the railroads was built.
The Alger House in Catlettsburg was equally well regarded. The mid-1800s also saw the birth of several local newspapers, the Big Sandy News, the Big Sandy Herald, and the Catlettsburg Tribune in Catlettsburg, and the Ashland Kentuckian, the Ashland Journal, and an anti-slavery publication called the American Union in Ashland. We're here at Ashland's old train depot, once the transportation hub of the region. But you know, back in 1856, the big story in all the newspapers was the arrival of a horse, an iron horse. People lined the banks of the Ohio River to welcome the locomotive Constitution to the area. The arrival of the locomotive then spurred work on Ashland's own railway system. In the late fall of 1857, Ashland dignitaries sitting in the caboose made the first train ride through the Princess Tunnel and returned with a load of iron for shipment down the Ohio. Shortly thereafter, daily trips between Ashland and Princess commenced, and other routes were soon started too.
It was ACNI, Ashland Coal and Iron Company. It ran from Ashland out to Hitchens, or it didn't run to Hitchens at first, it ran to Colton. They hauled coal and also hauled passengers for several years. Then we had Lexington and the Big Sandy Railroad. It connected in here at Ashland and went to Hitchens. It was supposed to go into Lexington, which took several years before they ever got it into Lexington. But when the ACNI started, that's when they built the tunnel down 6th Street and several tunnels between Ashland and Colton. Princess Tunnel's still out there. They had a lot of men, company stores, and everything out around Rush and Kilgore and Princess.
And with the railroad came more progress for Ashland. With progress came some problems. Ashland's new Board of Trustees dealt with the more pressing of them by issuing public ordinances against obscenity, indecency, vandalism, use of firearms in town, and giving whiskey to slaves without owners' consent. There also was an ordinance that prohibited theatrical or sleight of hand performances within a quarter-mile of town, as well as one stating that all hogs running loose on the streets should be promptly arrested, and fines were levied accordingly.
Back in March of 1961, I boarded a train for Lexington with a bunch of other guys for the state basketball tournament. A few days later, we brought the state basketball title back to Ashland. Things have changed over the last 25 years. Trains no longer run here, but there's still a winning team at the old depot. That's the team of dedicated banking professionals at Third National Bank. Hi, I'm Larry Conley, and I've always been associated with winners. And I'm proud to be associated with another winner, Third National Bank. Central Park. I spent a lot of time here when I was growing up in Ashland, but then Central Park goes back a long time. Laid out by M.T. Hilton, it was built as a gift to the people of Ashland. And recently, through the generosity of the estate of Ada Dietrich, Central Park has new lights installed throughout the park. The people of the Ashland area can be proud of Central Park, and it's one more reason why I'm proud to say Ashland is my hometown. I'm Larry Conley for Third National Bank.
After all the hard-won economic progress the area had made, well, it was time to celebrate, at least for a few days in 1860, at the first annual fair held in Central Park. It was sponsored by the Northeast Kentucky Agricultural and Mechanical Association. There were brass bands playing in the bandstand, horses running on the trotting track, people roaming through numerous exhibits and enjoying home-cooked food. But they imbibed no spirituous refreshments, for they were prohibited, you see.
Central Park had a large, high wooden fence around it originally. And during July, they had the races. Had a racetrack in the upper end of the park in the grandstand, and it was a half-mile track. And they had an amphitheater down in where the playground is today, and it was supposed to seat 5,000 people. This before Crab School was built in there. And through the years, through the summer months, they'd have different things in the park, like chautauquas and carnivals, circuses. That was really the circus field in the early days of Ashland, was the park. And in my time, we had about 50 big orange swings, double swings, that people would go and sit in summertime. They tore them out during the war and sold them for scrap.
I forget how many acres is in that park, but I know that when it was originally purchased by the city, the purchase price was $32,000, which is awful little for a thing like that. They have tried, different interest groups, to have something built in there like a stadium, but they always say, no, that's that's playground. That's picnic place. That's for folks to come together. We don't want a stadium in Central Park. My time goes way back in the teens when they used to have the county, big county programs there, and they had the horses racing. And my job was to get out there after the horses ran and cool them out. I would lead horses around, and maybe a horse would walk for a couple of hours and take a blanket off at a time, and I'd make maybe 50 cents, or walk 2 horses, make $1 in one day. And that was a lot of money.
Cliffside Park opened about 1890 and closed in 1922. It had a large Ferris wheel. It had a roller coaster, a merry-go-round. It had a very large casino, and that's where the big bands came to before Paramount opened. They came into that casino. It seated several hundred people. The casino was very big. It overlooked the lake, and you walk out onto the balcony and dance out onto the balcony, and bands playing. If you go up 29th Street, there's a church sitting up on the knoll there, and that's exactly the same spot as the casino sat. This side had a very large lake, boating, and had all kind of concession stands. The Camden Interstate Railroad, which owned the streetcar line, they eventually got a hold of it, and they operated on account of it was they can make a lot of money taking people to on the streetcar to Cliffside Park back as far as Huntington, and of course it's older. It was an older park in Camden. In fact, that's why they tore it out. They tore it out and moved a lot of it to Camden Park. These merry-go-rounds, whip, had a whip, caterpillar, a large swimming pool. They had a very large baseball field at Cliffside Park. It was enclosed. Had a fence around it. You had to pay admission to get in it. And they would stage in the summertime prize fights up there, and they were 5,000 people gathered in there in July the 4th, 1922, and seen Bill Bremer and Bob Martin fight for who fought Jack Dempsey for the championship of the world. And Bill Bremer won the fight, and Jack Dempsey, I think, knocked him out in the 10th round when they fought in New York or wherever they fought.
Boyd County, Kentucky. Boyd County was officially created back in 1860. It was named after 1st District Representative Lynn Boyd. And because back then Catlettsburg had nearly twice the population as Ashland, it was officially established as the county seat.
Well, in fact, it was Greenup County in them days. And they took part of Carter County and part of Greenup County and made Boyd County.
But there was trouble on the horizon for both Catlettsburg and Ashland when shock waves caused by the war between the states were felt throughout Kentucky. Although Kentucky was a slave-holding border state, she really tried to be neutral in the Civil War. But there was no way she could completely escape the tensions and uncertainties that gripped the whole country, especially when families were being torn apart because of their sympathies for one side or the other.
Eastern part of Kentucky, I'd say there's north. Maybe as you get on out in Kentucky, there's probably more southern. But right here on the border of Ohio, I'd say there's north. We had an encampment out in Central Park, but there was no battles around here. The closest battle I knew of was up Big Sandy. Was General Garfield had a army up there, and he stayed in Catlettsburg.
Central Park is one of the very busiest places in Ashland today. And it was a very busy place during the Civil War, too. See, right back in here, Union soldiers set up campsites in Central Park, and their wounded were treated at a makeshift Union hospital at the Aldine Hotel. Some Union soldiers, in fact, were buried beside Boyd County pioneers in local cemeteries.
During the Civil War, it was used as a Union hospital. Jenny Lind, a Swedish nightingale, was supposed to have stood on a rock on the other side of the river, and sing to these soldiers. It was in the hospital during the Civil War. Whether that's true or not, we don't know.
But for the most part, aside from that rare guerrilla raid by Confederate sympathizers, Catlettsburg and Ashland weathered the war in better condition than most communities.
They are a tunnel. They are a slave tunnel here in Ashland. And it's in the house down on 10th and 11th and Bath. It was just a small tunnel. It went out maybe 100 foot from the basement. What they done, these runaway slaves, when they was about to get captured, they'd take and hide them in this tunnel. And when these guards left, they took them out and took them across the river. These tunnels, they talk about going to the river, you know. They couldn't have done that. I mean, from Dr. Martin's home, this was all sandy, sorrel sandy, and they'd have been caving in. And so all they done was hide them in this tunnel, and later on let them escape across the river.
But as a result of the war, Boyd County did have to come to terms with the question of slavery. Slave labor, after all, had helped to build the county. Now, with the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery was abolished.
Fire protection is something a lot of people take for granted, but not here in Cannonsburg. The Cannonsburg Volunteer Fire Department and the people of Cannonsburg work together to raise the funds to build this fire station. Today, the people of this community have class fire protection. This spirit of teamwork is just one of the many reasons that I'm proud to call this area home. I'm Larry Conley for Third National Bank. Third National Bank makes more new car loans than any bank in the Ashland area. New car loans are a specialty of Third National Bank, and Third National's Consumer Credit Department offers extended customer hours and competitive interest rates. The Ashland area has some great new car dealers and a great bank for financing new cars. I'm Larry Conley for Third National Bank.
After the war, Catlettsburg strove to recapture her preeminent trade status, while Ashland continued to grow economically and socially. Economically, with the creation of Ashland Coal and Iron Company, Ashland Iron Furnace, and Norton Iron Works. Socially, with a rekindling of interest in public education. In 1876, another milestone was reached when the Kentucky legislature officially created the city of Ashland, and thus set in motion the formation of a local government. Catlettsburg had been incorporated as far back as 1858. H.B. Brodess, publisher of the American Union, was elected Ashland's first mayor. The late 1800s also brought incredible changes to the area, including the establishment of fire and police departments, an electric company, a telephone exchange, a waterworks, and a hospital. In Ashland, there was even a Chinese hand laundry run by a man named Wu John. He joined the parade of local businesses. One of the oddest sights, however, must have been the streetcars up and down Winchester Avenue. They were for a time run by mule power. Electrically operated trolleys eventually replaced them.
In 1906, they opened the South Ashland line up. It you transferred to 29th Street and went to South Ashland. At the end of that line was Moore Street. And you could catch a streetcar down 6th Street and go clear to Huntington in the 20s and 30s. And if you wanted to come back from Huntington and wanted to go to Portsmouth, you could catch a streetcar in Huntington and come down here to the 15th Street and get off, walk down to the ferry boat, get a transfer, cross the ferry boat onto a streetcar waiting for you up to the top of the ferry grade, and you go to Portsmouth from there. In fact, you could go from Huntington to Portsmouth on a streetcar.
An unusual thing happened in Ashland one day. The streetcar, which traveled actually from South Ashland, what we call the South Ashland streetcar, came down to 29th Winchester and turned toward town. It would go on through the town, the lower end, and when it's time to come back and make the trip back. Well, while it was parked out there, they reversed the trolley so they could take off. So they started out, and all at once the brakes quit. They said, well, the only thing to do is pull the trolley, and it'll stop itself. But it didn't. It kept moving down, and it had a hill to go down. So if you've ever been out that way, coming out of South Ashland, a little wood section that comes down, hits Geiger Crossing. Well, that streetcar gained more momentum, and it got all the way down and was nearing Central Avenue, where the Underground takes on. So the conductor that was on the thing, he said to the few people that were on the streetcar, said, don't worry now, because when it goes down this dip, it'll stop. But it didn't. It came up on the other side, went all the way to Winchester, couldn't make the turn to go to town, and came off of the tracks and wrecked and broke two telephone poles down. And there was a lot of excitement, and I think they have the pictures at the Independent. I've never seen the pictures that they took at that time, but it was quite an excitement in Ashland.
With regard to education, when John G. Crabb became superintendent of Ashland schools in 1893, he brought with him a new passion for institutional reform. His Catlettsburg counterpart, J.B. Leach, shared this passion for education, and both men helped to revitalize this area's school systems. Catlettsburg city fathers like to describe their town at the turn of the century as a receiving depot for the rich products of the fertile valley of the Big Sandy, unequaled for its mineral wealth. And they boasted about the town's 3 newspapers, 4 churches, 4 schools, 5 hotels, a courthouse, post office, a bank, a brewery, a tannery, flouring mill, sawmills, an iron foundry, machine shop, tin shop, saddle shop, jewelers, drugstore, bookstore, debating society, and a billiard hall. Not to be outdone, the Ashland Improvement Company was formed to further the economic changes that had already occurred and to promote Ashland and the industry, words that had in many people's minds become synonymous. The company described the Ashland of the late 19th century in a pamphlet designed to entice new businesses. Cited as positive factors for locating there were railroad and river transportation, cheap fuel, valuable minerals, timber, beautiful home sites, and plenty of churches and schools. The health of Ashland has always been excellent, said the pamphlet, and the high and beautiful situation of the town makes it a most delightful place of residence. The town has been built roomily over considerable territory, but is a very charming place in appearance, with well-graded streets 100 feet in width, shaded by trees and adorned by reserved grass plots that give the resident streets the appearance of boulevards. The article continued, many of the residences are very handsome and costly, while the homes of the poorer class are comfortable, neat, and what is better, 7/10 of the working men of our town own the houses in which they live, and thus form the bone and sinew of a strongly attached and patriotic population. The community is orderly and law-abiding, the article continued, and has had less trouble from strikes and fewer instances of bloodshed and disorder than almost any manufacturing town that might be named. So there. One famous incident of bloodshed and disorder, however, was what has come to be known as the Ashland Tragedy.
On December the 24th, 1881, Miss Gibbons, who was the mother of Fanny and Bobby Gibbons, went across the street and got a little girl by the name of Emma Carrico to stay all night with her 2 children while she was gone to Arton to visit one of the other daughters. Along about midnight, 3 men broke into the home, proceeded to rape the 2 children, 2 girls, and they killed all 3 of them, the boy too. And they set the house on fire. to try to burn the evidence. The children was dragged out of the house before they burned up by Mr. Faulkner, who lived across the street. Later on, one of the men confessed to the murder, implicating 2 other men. He was tried at Catlettsburg and sentenced life in prison because he turned state evidence against the other 2. His name was George Ellis. Well, the 2 he implicated was Ellis Craft and William Neal. Later on in June 2nd, 1882, 12 men marched up Front Street, 12 masked men marched up Front Street, proceeded to the old Chattaroy roundhouse, and had a colored man by the name of Stokes to fire the engine up and take him to Catlettsburg to proceed to get this man out of jail. Brought him back down to Ashland at 28th and Mill Street and hung him on a sycamore tree. And he wasn't cut down from that sycamore tree till late in the next afternoon. The other 2 men 2 years later was tried at Grayson, and they were also hung over the crime, which was called the Ashland tragedy.
Local newspapers had a field day with the story. The turn of the century brought the area another new one, the Ashland Daily Independent. Boyd Countyans looking for something to do on a lazy summer day could no doubt find in their local papers stories about upcoming events that, well, might include a Chautauqua in Central Park, day of racing at Catlettsburg's racetrack, or streetcar excursions to Cliffside Park. They could also find out who was headlining the local vaudeville theaters or what silent movies were playing at a local Nickelodeon. In the early 20th century, a wide variety of entertainment opportunities existed.
Well, when I was growing up, we had the Capitol, the Grand, the Modern, the Edisonian, and Columbia theaters in Ashland, downtown Ashland. And the Lyric was up on 29th and Winchester. But before that, we had an opera house, which was on 17th and Greenup. It burned in 1931, and it had a very large auditorium, which was large for the size of Ashland, which seated better than 900 people. And they were stage plays, came through here and sometimes show for a week at the Opera House. And then Capitol was built. Capitol Theater was considered the best theater in Ashland until the Paramount was built. Capitol was built as Arcadia in 1921. Opened on Christmas Eve, 1921. Grand opened in 1915. It's where Revco is today. Modern's been torn down for several years, so is the Edisonia. The Columbia, it's torn down too. It's where Henry House's plumbing company is today. It was strictly a vaudeville show, Columbia Theater was. In the early days, they had piano players at all of them. Of course, when the Capitol opened as the Arcadia, it had an orchestra. Quite a few big bands played around here, especially after the Paramount opened. They played the Paramount on the stage. They had better facilities down there for stages in the Capitol did. Grant had actually the better stage in the Capitol.
Boyd Countyans could also take pride in their own creative efforts. Before the parks and the theaters, many citizens amused and entertained their families with storytelling, with music, and craft making. In the early 1900s, Catlettsburg's river trade began declining as the railroads transported more and more goods, including timber, to markets throughout the land. An era was slowly coming to a close in the Gate City. However, Ashland's industrial progress continued. A turning point arrived when George M. Verity selected Ashland as the site for a new steel processing plant in 1920. Ashland found itself the home of the nation's first successful continuous rolling mill. And from that time on, Armco and Ashland's history have been closely linked. The Roaring Twenties also saw the establishment of the area's other major employer, the Ashland Oil and Refining Company. The location of that refinery brought good news and good jobs to Catlettsburg as well as all of Boyd County. As both companies expanded in later years, so did the local population, with Ashland's reaching nearly 30,000 by 1925. Such expansion brought about another building boom with new schools, new banks, a new railroad passenger station, new library, new hotels, new bridges, and new bus lines, all coming to Boyd County. The Ohio River, it's always been the lifeblood of Boyd County. But you know, back in 1937, the river went on a rampage and rewrote the record books. I know something about that. It was 6 feet 3 inches in my house. Both Catlettsburg and Ashland were very hard hit. Floodwaters covered most of downtown Ashland and extended at some points as far as Central Avenue.
Finally, the water got so high up, my wife, they took her out one of the windows over to one of her sister's house, and I stayed in there the next day, and the National Guards made me get out because they claimed there's so much gasoline on the water coming down Greenup Avenue, and it was deep out in the middle of Greenup Avenue. I'd say it was at least 10 foot deep out in the middle. Very swift current.
I remember it was quite the excitement. The bank on 60th Winchester, where the American Bank is now, they thought they were going to lose the building because the water working inside get into the enough of it the building may fall. So they let the water in the windows, get the same pressure inside as you would have outside. That was a great flood.
Boyd County's industrial base became even more significant during the dark days of World War II, as both Armco and Ashland Oil increased their outputs in response to wartime needs. The late 1900s have also proved to be an equally challenging time for Boyd County. What has always seen Boyd Countyans through times of hardship has been a strength of character, coupled with the determination to do what has to be done, qualities born of a pioneering heritage. Boyd County's founding fathers and mothers developed common sense priorities of hard work, self-reliance, which succeeding generations have attempted to match. Their fierce commitment to their families and to the progress of this area resulted in a proud history which we can all celebrate. The continuation of that commitment brought us from log schoolhouses to multi-million-dollar school systems, from trails to turnpikes, and from farmlands to factories. Many of our Boyd County ancestors made significant contributions to the creation of Catlettsburg and Ashland, and they're worthy of remembrance. Through the years, Boyd County has had its share of good times and bad times, but prospects for the future are really looking up. Working together, we are creating tomorrow's history today. And for Boyd County, this is only the beginning.